"This is a $150,000 deficit, Claire," Aunt Marion announced at the Boston architectural tender meeting. Uncle Silas slid the fraudulent invoice across the mahogany table, leaning in with a cold, contemptuous sneer. "You're not family, Claire. We just pitied you," he hissed in front of the entire board. "We spent 20 years feeding you and putting a roof over your head. Now it's time to pay your debt. We expect you to liquidate your life savings immediately to cover this." I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I rubbed my eyes, finding only clarity. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. To understand how I arrived at this exact moment, you have to look at the ledger of the past 20 years. I was taken in by Aunt Marion and Uncle Silas when I was 7 years old, but I was never a daughter to them. I was an acquired asset. My childhood wasn't a family experience. It was a long-term subscription, and I was the one footing the bill. They provided a roof, and in exchange, I became the invisible servant, the silent investor in their twisted version of a family. As I grew older and my architectural talent became apparent, my role shifted from domestic help to unpaid professional consultant. I drafted the blueprints that won Silas his first major awards. I designed the renovations that Marion paraded in front of her country club friends. My intellectual property enriched them, building the foundation of their prestigious firm, while I remained in the background, a ghost in my own life. This was the trap of cruel normalization. You see, when a family normalizes cruelty over decades, they don't see themselves as villains. They simply adjust the baseline of what they are owed. My sacrifices became their expected dividends. The more I gave, the less value I held in their eyes. Until my exploitation wasn't just accepted, it was required. They didn't feel guilty about handing me a fraudulent 6-figure invoice because, in their minds, my entire existence was a debt I owed them for the sheer privilege of breathing their air. They had normalized my subjugation so entirely that my compliance was indistinguishable from the air conditioning in their luxury cars, expected, silent, and unnoticed until it stopped working. I looked at the invoice sitting on the boardroom table. The numbers were fabricated, a desperate attempt to plug the holes of Silas's failing investments. For 20 years, I had subsidized their lifestyle with my talent and my silence. I had watched my cousins, Beatrice and Warren, receive the finest educations, the newest cars, and the unearned promotions within the family firm. They were the primary shareholders of my parents' charity. I was just the overhead cost. I stared at the faces of the board members around the room. Some looked away in discomfort. Others watched with the morbid curiosity of bystanders at a traffic accident. Marion's smile was tight and victorious. Silas leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms with the smug certainty of a man who held all the leverage. They expected me to break down, to plead, or to quietly accept the blame to save the family's public face. They wanted me to absorb their failure so they could maintain their flawless facade, but they fundamentally misunderstood the situation. The ledger was finally closed. I was no longer interested in subsidizing their fraud. The 20-year contract of my silence had just expired, and I was about to initiate a hostile takeover of my own life. Every late night I had spent fixing their flawed structural designs. Every weekend I had sacrificed to ensure their presentations were flawless. It had all been a down payment on this exact moment of clarity. I wasn't their family member. I was their most valuable, unacknowledged employee. And today, I was tendering my resignation. I reached into my briefcase, pulling out the emergency wire transfer mandate Silas had drafted. Beatrice, sitting to my left, let out a soft, mocking laugh. "Just sign it, Claire," she whispered, her tone dripping with the kind of venom only a golden child can muster. "It's the least you can do after everything Mom and Dad have given you." Warren smirked from the other side of the table, already checking his phone, bored by the predictability of my submission. And I did submit, at least on paper. I clicked my pen and signed my name next to the sum, $150,000. My hand moved methodically across the paper. I didn't tremble. I didn't hesitate. I authorized the immediate liquidation of my life savings, the entire safety net I had meticulously built to launch my independent firm. To anyone watching, it looked like total defeat. But this is the invisible chain of the survivor. When you spend your entire life in a prison without bars, your initial compliance isn't a sign of weakness, it's a deeply ingrained survival mechanism. I had been conditioned by years of emotional subjugation to absorb their blows, to mistake learned helplessness for familial duty. I was paying the ransom they demanded because the invisible chains they had wrapped around my mind dictated that my safety depended on their satisfaction. But as the ink dried on that check, the final link of that chain snapped. The transaction was complete, and with it, the last ounce of my misplaced loyalty evaporated. I slid the authorization form across the table. Silas snatched it up with greedy fingers, his eyes gleaming with the triumph of a successful extortion. Marion let out a performative sigh of relief, patting my hand with cold, manicured fingers. "Good girl," she murmured, a hollow endearment that sealed her fate. They thought they had won. They thought this was the end of the negotiation. But as I watched them celebrate their petty theft, a profound internal awakening took root in my mind. I was no longer the frightened orphan desperate for a place at their table. I was an architect. I knew how to dismantle a structure by attacking its load-bearing walls. I had just paid that massive sum to purchase my absolute freedom from guilt. I had bought the right to destroy them without a single pang of conscience. The anger wasn't hot or chaotic. It was ice-cold and precise. I wasn't going to protect people who despised me anymore. I was going to audit their entire existence. I gathered my documents, snapped my briefcase shut, and stood up. The room was already moving on, the board members shifting their attention to the next agenda item, dismissing me as a resolved issue. They had no idea that I wasn't walking away in defeat. I was stepping back to survey the demolition site. The check I had just handed them wasn't a lifeline for their failing business. It was the rope they would use to hang themselves. I walked out of the boardroom, my heels clicking sharply against the marble floor, calculating the exact trajectory of their imminent collapse. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open just as I reached for the handle. The celebratory murmur behind me died instantly, replaced by a suffocating, terrified silence. Standing in the doorway was great-grandmother Eleanor. At 89 years old, the matriarch and founder of the construction empire rarely left her estate, let alone appeared at tender meetings. She leaned heavily on her silver-tipped cane, but her posture was rigid, her eyes sharp and merciless as they swept over the room. She was the ultimate authority, the original architect of our family's wealth, and she looked absolutely lethal. I stepped aside, giving her the floor. "Marion." "Silas." Eleanor's voice cut through the stagnant air like a scalpel. "I have spent the last 30 minutes reviewing the financial disclosures you attempted to hide from me." Silas turned the color of wet ash. The check he had just extorted from me slipped from his fingers, fluttering onto the polished mahogany. "Grandmother," Marion stammered, her usual arrogant polish shattering instantly. "We can explain. It's just a minor cash flow issue. Claire was just being extorted to cover your gross incompetence," Eleanor interrupted, her tone vibrating with cold fury. She walked slowly into the room, her cane striking the floor in a steady, ominous rhythm. Every executive and board member shrank back in their chairs. "I built this empire on precision, integrity, and structural soundness. You have spent the last 2 decades eroding its foundations with your greed and your breathtaking cruelty." She stopped at the head of the table, looking down at Beatrice and Warren, who were practically trembling in their designer suits. "You took in a brilliant, capable girl," Eleanor continued, gesturing toward me without taking her eyes off Marion, "and instead of nurturing her, you treated her like an indentured servant. You stole her intellectual property. You claimed her architectural designs as your own, and today you attempted to bankrupt her to hide your own failures." The silence in the room was absolute. Nobody dared to breathe. Silas opened his mouth, perhaps to offer another pathetic lie, but Eleanor slammed her cane against the floor. "The celebration is over," she declared, her voice ringing with finality. "Effective immediately, I am initiating a full legal and forensic audit of this firm and the family estate. Every account, every contract, Every project you have touched will be dismantled and examined." She turned to look at me, and for a fraction of a second, the ice in her eyes melted into profound respect. "Claire, pick up your check. You owe these parasites nothing. My attorneys will transfer my full proxy to you by noon. Burn them to the ground." I walked back to the table, picked up the slip of paper, and deliberately tore it into tiny pieces, letting them fall over Silas's pristine financial reports. The power shift was absolute and instantaneous. They weren't shocked by what they had done. They were shocked that I had stopped playing along, and that the highest authority in the room was funding my retaliation. Eleanor didn't just level the playing field. She handed me the detonator. I met Marion's terrified gaze, my expression completely blank. The audit wasn't just a threat, it was a promise of total annihilation. The audit began exactly 14 minutes after Eleanor's declaration. I didn't waste time on emotional processing or triumphant gloating. I drove straight to the gleaming downtown offices of Sterling and Vance, stepping into the conference room to meet Daniel, the most ruthless corporate litigator in Boston. Daniel didn't deal in feelings. He dealt in asset recovery and corporate executions. He was the perfect partner for a hostile takeover. We didn't exchange pleasantries. I dropped my meticulously kept records onto his glass desk, 20 years of diverted funds, uncredited architectural drafts, and coercive financial agreements. "I want them frozen," I said, my voice steady and clinical. "Every joint account, every trust they have access to, every corporate credit line tied to the firm." Daniel adjusted his glasses, his eyes scanning the first few pages of my documents. A predatory smile touched the corners of his mouth. "They've been sloppy, Claire. Arrogance usually breeds terrible accounting." We spent the next 4 hours systematically dismantling Marion and Silas's financial infrastructure. This wasn't revenge. It was accounting. I sat beside Daniel as he drafted emergency injunctions, citing Eleanor's mandate and the glaring irregularities in the firm's ledgers. We tracked how Marion had systematically diverted bonuses meant for my designs into offshore shell companies controlled by Warren and Beatrice. We documented how Silas had forged my signature on liability waivers for his structurally compromised projects. I watched the numbers align on the spreadsheet, translating decades of emotional abuse into cold, hard, prosecutable data. I had been the silent investor in their version of family, and now I was aggressively liquidating my shares. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the legal mobilization was complete. Using Eleanor's irrevocable proxy as the majority shareholder, Daniel bypassed the courts entirely and instructed the bank to immediately revoke their access to the firm's operational accounts. As I sat in the austere conference room, my phone began to light up. The notifications poured in like a frantic digital heartbeat. It was Marion, then Silas, then Beatrice. Their credit cards were declining. Their access to the firm's capital was locked. The panicked texts shifted rapidly from arrogant demands to confused pleading, and finally, to pure, unadulterated panic. "They're locked out," Daniel confirmed, closing his laptop. "They have zero liquidity. They can't even buy a cup of coffee using corporate funds right now." I looked at my phone, watching the missed calls tally up. I didn't feel a shred of pity. I had spent years rubbing my eyes, trying to summon affection for people who viewed me as a highly profitable appliance. Now, viewing them through the lens of legal strategy, I saw them exactly for what they were, bad investments. "What's the next phase?" Daniel asked, leaning back in his chair. "We keep digging," I replied smoothly. "They demanded that massive payout to cover a deficit. I want to know exactly where that deficit originated. People this greedy don't just lose money, they hide it." Daniel nodded, already preparing the subpoenas for the firm's private servers. We were no longer just defending my assets. We were actively hunting theirs. The blueprints of their lives were laid out before me, and I was identifying every single structural flaw, preparing to bring the entire toxic edifice crashing down to the ground. It was exactly 8 o'clock on a Tuesday morning when Daniel called me back into his office. The clinical detachment he usually maintained had been replaced by a grim, laser-focused intensity. He didn't offer me a coffee or ask how I was doing. He simply turned his dual monitors toward me and tapped the screen with his pen. "You were right to look into the deficit, Claire," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "But you aimed too low. That ransom they tried to extort from you? It wasn't to cover a business failure. It was a smokescreen." I pulled my chair closer, my eyes scanning the heavily redacted offshore bank statements and corporate registry documents he had unearthed. The numbers were staggering, far exceeding petty cash extraction. "Explain it to me," I demanded, entirely stripped of emotion. Daniel pulled up a secondary file, displaying original architectural blueprints dated 22 years ago. I recognized the drafting style instantly. The sharp, innovative lines, the sustainable integration, they were my biological parents' designs. "After your parents died," Daniel explained methodically, "their intellectual property was supposed to be placed in a trust for you until you turned 25. The copyrights to their most revolutionary sustainable housing models were independently appraised at over $8 million. I stared at the blueprints, my heart beating in a slow, icy rhythm. Marion and Silas were the trustees. "Yes," Daniel confirmed, "but they didn't just mismanage the trust. They engaged in a calculated criminal conspiracy. They created shell companies, transferred the copyrights out of your trust, and licensed your parents' designs to overseas developers. The royalties have been flooding into their private accounts for over a decade. They used your parents' genius to build their fortune." The magnitude of the betrayal hit me, but it didn't shatter me. It calcified my resolve. They hadn't just mistreated an orphaned niece, they had systematically pillaged the legacy of the dead to fund their lavish reality. "And the deficit?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. "The deficit was a manufactured crisis," Daniel replied. "The overseas developers found out about the fraudulent licensing and threatened to sue. Silas needed that exact amount immediately to pay a retainer for a shadow legal team to bury the evidence. He was making you pay for the shovel he was going to use to bury your own inheritance. I absorbed the data. Love was a contract, and I had been paying the subscription fee for my own robbery. This moves beyond civil litigation, Daniel. This is felony fraud, embezzlement, and criminal conspiracy." I looked at my parents' blueprints, the brilliant legacy they had left me, stained by my relatives' greed. "We don't just freeze them out," I instructed, standing up from the desk. "We refer this to the district attorney. I want the shell companies exposed, and I want them backed into a corner where surrendering the copyrights is their only option to avoid a maximum sentence." Daniel smiled, a sharp, dangerous expression. "I've already prepared the brief for the prosecutor's office. We have the paper trail, the wire transfers, and the forged trust documents. The truth was lethal, and I was holding the trigger. I was going to erase them from the architectural world entirely. The Boston Design Gala was the pinnacle of the architectural season, a glittering assembly of the city's elite. I arrived precisely at 8 o'clock, stepping into the grand ballroom not as an appendage to my uncle's failing firm, but as the sole founder of my newly launched independent practice. The venue was awash in champagne and flashbulbs, but my focus remained absolute. Tonight was not just a professional debut, it was the execution of judgment. I unveiled my masterpiece, a sprawling, sustainable urban complex based on the reclaimed original blueprints of my late parents, enhanced by my own modern innovations. Across the ballroom, I spotted Marion, Silas, and Beatrice. They looked ragged. Their accounts were frozen. The criminal investigations were looming, and their social standing was evaporating by the second. Since their VIP tickets had been comped months in advance, they attended the gala in a desperate bid to project normalcy and court last-minute investors, but the panic in their eyes was palpable. As I stood by my exhibition display, surrounded by impressed investors and city planners, Beatrice broke away from her parents. She marched toward me, her designer gown failing to mask the frantic, unhinged energy radiating from her. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" Beatrice hissed, stopping inches from my face. She smelled of gin and desperation. The ambient noise of the gala began to quiet as people noticed the escalating tension. Smartphones were already rising, camera lenses focusing on the unfolding spectacle. I didn't flinch. I didn't step back. I think I am exceptionally good at accounting, Beatrice. I checked the ledgers. My clinical indifference pushed her over the edge. Beatrice suffered a catastrophic, spectacular meltdown. "You owe us!" she screamed, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "We put a roof over your head." So what if my parents took the copyrights? So what if they used the trust fund to buy my cars and pay for Warren's apartment? They deserved it for putting up with you. You were just a pathetic charity case, and that money was our compensation. The silence in the ballroom was absolute, save for the distinct, continuous clicking of smartphone cameras recording every single word. She was screaming a full, unprompted confession to felony embezzlement and fraud in front of Boston's most influential developers, city officials, and the press. I looked at her, my expression devoid of sympathy or rage. "You just admitted, on camera, to knowingly benefiting from a criminal conspiracy to defraud a minor," I stated clearly, ensuring the surrounding microphones caught my voice. "Your parents stole $8 million in intellectual property. And you..." Beatrice's face drained of color as the reality of her words crashed into her gin-soaked brain. She looked around at the sea of recording phones, the horrified faces of her former peers, and the total social ruin she had just cemented. Silas and Marion rushed over, desperately trying to pull her away, trying to shield their faces from the flashes. But it was too late. The power flip was complete. They weren't just financially ruined. They were publicly obliterated. I turned my back on their frantic, pathetic retreat, picking up my glass of sparkling water to toast my new investors. The demolition was finished. The aftermath was swift, brutal, and entirely legal. Marion and Silas were indicted on multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, and criminal conspiracy. The documentary evidence Daniel and I uncovered was irrefutable, flawlessly bolstered by Beatrice's viral, unhinged confession at the gala. They were systematically forced to liquidate everything they owned: the luxury cars, the exclusive country club memberships, and the sprawling suburban estate, just to pay their aggressive defense attorneys and the staggering court-ordered restitution. Warren and Beatrice found themselves entirely cut off from the endless flow of stolen capital, forced to navigate a harsh reality where they actually had to work for a living. They were stripped of the stolen prestige they had worn like cheap armor for decades. Their financial and social ruin was absolute, a natural consequence of a foundation built on theft. To avoid maximum sentences in federal prison, they accepted a brutal plea deal that included surrendering the full, undisputed rights to my parents' intellectual property back to my name. With my legacy secured, I didn't just rebuild my career, I elevated it. I established a comprehensive architectural scholarship foundation specifically for orphaned and disadvantaged youth. I wanted to ensure that brilliant, vulnerable minds would never be subjected to the kind of transactional exploitation I had endured for 20 years. The foundation wasn't built out of spite or lingering anger. It was built out of a profound desire to create a structural integrity that my relatives had severely lacked. I funded it fully, watching young, talented architects thrive without the heavy, invisible chains of conditional affection holding them down. I had dismantled the trap of my past and engineered a sanctuary for the future. I stand in my office today, looking out over the sprawling Boston skyline, watching the afternoon sun reflect off the glass of sustainable buildings I designed. The cold, clinical anger that fueled my methodical retaliation has quieted completely, replaced by a profound, unshakable peace. The balance sheet is finally clear. My relatives had desperately tried to bury me under the immense weight of their own incompetence and greed, but they fundamentally forgot that I was an architect. I knew exactly how to build a fortress out of the stones they threw at me. Justice wasn't just about watching their fraudulent empire fall. It was about ensuring I rose higher and built stronger than they could ever reach. I've come to realize that cutting toxic ties is the most essential, life-saving renovation you can ever undertake. You cannot build an authentic, beautiful future on a rotting foundation of abuse, no matter how loudly society insists that blood relations are paramount. Sometimes, The title of family is just a fraudulent invoice, demanding continuous payment for love and protection that were never truly given. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes, it's the only way to set yourself free. I didn't forgive them by ever allowing them back into my life or minimizing their crimes. I forgave myself for ever believing I needed their approval to exist. I took back my name, reclaimed my parents' brilliant legacy, and built a genuine, authentic life, brick by brick, truth by truth. The view from up here is absolutely breathtaking. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community.